At the African Union Summit, Traoré shook the world with a thunderous speech. They speak of net zero and a green future. But in Burkina Faso, my people still have no electricity for schools or hospitals, only for foreign-owned gold and uranium mines. They call it climate aid. I call it corporate profit. Africa will no longer be silent. We will not sign away our future. We demand climate justice and the right to control our own resources. And to you, Mr. Mark Carney, I give you 72 hours to withdraw from our land. The story begins on the 1st of September 2025, when Mark Carney first unveiled his pledge to bring billions of dollars into Africa's green transition. The announcement was celebrated across international headlines. For Burkina Faso, a nation often overlooked on the global stage, the promise seemed like a rare moment of recognition. Carney's coalition of banks and investment funds declared that the money would help deliver renewable energy projects, from solar power to rural electrification. In the villages of Burkina Faso, families allowed themselves to imagine a future where their children could study under electric light, where clinics would no longer struggle without power, and where clean energy could replace the burning of wood and charcoal. But when the engineers and contractors finally arrived, reality looked very different. The solar arrays were not built near schools or villages. The transmission lines did not extend into rural communities. Instead, the new infrastructure concentrated its power directly into the mining corridors, feeding the operations of Western corporations extracting gold and uranium. Ordinary citizens remained in darkness, watching as the promised green future illuminated only the factories of outsiders. It did not take long for questions to spread. Was net zero truly about saving the planet, or was it about securing profit under the guise of climate aid? Critics inside Burkina Faso began to call it a performance stage for Wall Street, not a solution for Africa. Even some foreign observers admitted that the money circled back to Western investors, leaving little behind for the people who were supposed to benefit. And then, in one of his earliest speeches on the issue, President Ibrahim Traoré gave words to this growing frustration. Standing before his citizens, he declared, "Net zero, calculated in London, means net darkness for our villages." It was a sentence that resonated not just across Burkina Faso, but throughout Africa, an indictment of a system that promised hope while delivering dependence. But this was only the beginning of a deeper revelation, one that would soon expose how sovereignty itself was being bargained away under the banner of climate finance. The contracts behind the so-called climate funds revealed a harsh truth. Burkina Faso had to open its gold, uranium, and other resources to foreign corporations. What was sold as sustainability was in fact a deal that traded sovereignty for money. President Ibrahim Traoré exposed this in a fiery speech. "These are not investments in our future. They are modern chains written in green ink." His words sparked immediate reactions at home. Students debated dignity, miners protested, and banners in Ouagadougou declared, "Light for the people, not for corporations." Western media defended Mark Carney and painted Traoré as reckless. But in Russia, China, and much of the global South, he was hailed as a symbol of resistance. Even in the United States, activists and scholars quoted his call, "We need light in every African home." At the United Nations, Traoré declared, "We do not need promises, we need power in every African home." The silence that followed turned climate pledges into a fight for justice and sovereignty. In Burkina Faso, citizens rallied behind him, reviving the spirit of Sankara with the motto, "Burkina lights itself." Politicians tied to the West lost ground as independence became the demand. Across Africa, from Mali to Ghana, activists condemned green colonialism, and leaders quietly sought their own energy paths. Globally, the movement was hailed as the new African awakening. Burkina Faso, once seen as small, had become the spark for a continent, forcing the world to ask, who really benefits from net zero? For many Americans over the age of 40, Ibrahim Traoré's defiance did not sound new. It felt like déjà vu, an echo of an era they thought had passed. His voice carried the memory of the Cold War years, when leaders from the global South, men like Nasser, Castro, Sankara, or Nkrumah, stood before the world and declared that their nations would no longer be pawns on the global chessboard. From Burkina Faso, a country dismissed for decades as small and peripheral, came a new echo of that bold spirit. A young man, barely in his 30s, was doing what many thought impossible, forcing the world to listen. In Washington, however, there was no romance in the air. Inside the Pentagon, the State Department, and Congress, Traore's words landed like a threat. Briefings warned that Burkina Faso could drift into Russia's orbit if it rejected Carney's climate funds. Senators argued on television that the Sahel might destabilize if populist rhetoric replaced cooperation with the West. Think tanks published reports filled with graphs and warnings, insisting that what seemed like a moral stand was in fact a geopolitical gamble. For U.S. policymakers, this was not about justice or dignity, it was about power, influence, and strategy. But outside of government halls, America heard a different story. On campuses like Howard, Princeton, and UCLA, students dissected Traoré's words in seminars. Professors drew parallels between his rhetoric and the civil rights struggle. In African-American communities across Detroit, Chicago, and Atlanta, his message resonated deeply. They saw in him a continuation of the struggle for dignity, a leader who dared to say out loud what many had whispered, that global finance still treated Africa not as a partner, but as a resource pool. Talk radio shows lit up with callers asking uncomfortable questions. Do we want to be remembered as the nation that praised Carney while silencing Traoré? For these Americans, the issue was not geopolitics, it was conscience. In Europe, the reaction was conflicted. Official statements from Brussels and Berlin praised net zero as humanity's only path forward. Yet in private, diplomats admitted unease. Activists in France and Germany started asking pointed questions. How much of this climate finance actually lights African homes? How much stays locked in Western banks? The criticism spread through newspapers and television debates. For years, Europe had positioned itself as a moral authority on climate. Now, one young African leader had forced it onto the defensive. Meanwhile, China and Russia wasted absolutely no time in seizing the moment. For Beijing, Traoré's words were a gift-living proof of the narrative they had been carefully constructing for decades. That China represented an alternative form of partnership, one free from the strings of Western aid. State media in Beijing ran headlines almost instantly. Burkina Faso chooses partnership without conditions. On CCTV, anchors praised Traoré as a leader of courage, a man who embodied the principle of equality between nations. Panel discussions showcased images of Burkina Faso's dusty villages alongside renderings of futuristic solar grids, promising that Chinese technology would bring light to every African home. Behind the polished coverage, Chinese envoys quietly drafted proposals. Packages for solar plants, lines of credit for infrastructure loans, training programs for African engineers, and entire shipments of renewable energy equipment were offered with breathtaking speed. To Beijing, the opportunity was twofold: build goodwill in the Sahel and position China as the indispensable partner of Africa's next energy revolution. Moscow, as always, played a different tune, louder, brasher, and unapologetically political. Russian leaders wasted no words in diplomacy. State television declared outright, Traoré is the modern Sankara. In speeches broadcast across Africa with subtitles in French, Arabic, and Swahili, Russian officials hailed him as the voice of sovereignty in a world ruled by financiers. Editorials in Russian papers compared him to historic revolutionaries who had defied imperialism, while military academies analyzed his defiance as a strategic blow to Western influence in Africa. Where Washington dismissed Traoré as reckless and naive, Moscow framed him as heroic and prophetic. And to young Africans scrolling through social media, Russia's portrayal spread like wildfire. A leader who dared to speak truth to power, a president who belonged not to Burkina Faso alone, but to the entire global South. Yet while foreign powers sought to shape the narrative, the most profound reaction came from within Africa itself. Across Mali, Niger, Ghana, and Senegal, student groups rallied in lecture halls and courtyards. They painted banners with slogans such as "No to Green Colonialism" and "Burkina Lights Itself." Debates erupted in universities, where young Africans dissected Traoré's speech line by line, treating it as a manifesto for their generation. In Ouagadougou, artists painted murals of Traoré beside Thomas Sankara, linking the two in a visual lineage of resistance. On radio shows, callers praised him for saying what so many leaders had been afraid to say. Civil society organizations moved quickly from words to action. Cooperatives were formed to explore solar and hydro projects built with local resources, declaring that Africa could no longer afford to wait for permission to power its own future. The shift was not merely cultural, it was political. Parties that had long leaned on Western donors suddenly found themselves on shaky ground. Citizens questioned their loyalty, accusing them of selling sovereignty in exchange for temporary funds. In local town halls, debates grew fiery. On the airwaves of national radio, callers demanded leaders who would put dignity first. Politicians who failed to respond were jeered as collaborators, while those who echoed Traoré's defiance saw their popularity rise. The ground was moving, and even the most cautious leaders could feel it. Quietly, in rooms closed to the public eye, regional governments began entertaining a radical proposal: the creation of a Sahel Energy Alliance. To outsiders, it was merely another acronym in a continent already full of them, but to those present, it represented something far more ambitious: a daring attempt to pool the natural resources, technical knowledge, and youthful ingenuity of the Sahel nations into a cooperative framework designed to liberate Africa from dependency. The plan envisioned solar farms stretching across desert plains, hydroelectric dams harnessing the power of untapped rivers, and wind projects capturing the gusts that sweep across the savanna. Crucially, these would be built without Western oversight, financed and directed by Africans themselves. At first, the idea was small, tentative, even fragile, nothing more than a whisper of possibility. Yet the symbolism was seismic. For the first time in generations, Africa was beginning to picture itself not as a scattering of weak states competing for foreign approval, but as a block of nations united by shared interests, shared struggles, and a shared destiny. The symbolism did not remain confined to those closed-door meetings. Soon, the African press seized on it. Commentators in Bamako, Niamey, Dakar, and Ouagadougou described the proposal as a second independence. Journalists began to search for words to describe the atmosphere building across the continent, and they found it: the new African awakening. Within weeks, the phrase was repeated on radio shows, printed on posters, and debated in universities. It carried different meanings depending on who used it. To activists, it meant hope, the dawn of a future built on self-reliance. To cautious politicians, it meant danger, a challenge to relationships they had carefully cultivated with donors. To entrepreneurs, it meant opportunity, the chance to invest in Africa's energy revolution. To Western diplomats, it meant disruption, the possibility of losing control over a region they once considered firmly within their grasp. But no matter the interpretation, the essence was the same. Africa was no longer willing to be cast as the passive recipient of charity. It was demanding respect, partnership, and sovereignty. The ripples of this shift did not stop at Africa's borders. In London and New York, the financial community felt a tremor. For years, Carney's coalition of climate finance had been praised as a model for aligning capital with sustainability. But suddenly, the very communities it was supposed to benefit were denouncing it as hollow. In hushed conversations at investment banks, analysts whispered that the coalition risked collapsing under its contradictions. If the Africans reject it, one strategist reportedly said, the entire moral foundation of net zero crumbles. Some fund managers admitted privately that the banner of net zero had grown too entangled with corporate balance sheets and not nearly entangled enough with the lives of ordinary people. The press, too, began sharpening its tone. What had once been polite applause now transformed into interrogation. At high-profile summits in Davos, New York, and Geneva, journalists who once hailed Mark Carney as the intellectual father of sustainable finance began pressing him with questions that cut deep into the credibility of his entire project. Cameras rolled as reporters demanded, does net zero serve Wall Street more than Ouagadougou? How do you explain villages still living in darkness while billions flow through climate funds? Why do the so-called beneficiaries remain powerless, while balance sheets in London and New York shine brighter than ever? For years, Carney had moved through conferences as a man beyond reproach, a visionary whose presence alone seemed to bestow legitimacy. But suddenly, the protective aura around him cracked. The once confident technocrat now looked defensive, even vulnerable. His careful language, designed to reassure investors and politicians alike, sounded hollow when compared against the raw testimony of African citizens whose homes still lacked electricity. The aura of inevitability that had cloaked the climate coalition, the sense that there was no alternative but to follow its model, began to fracture. For the first time, a narrative emerged that the emperor of net zero might have no clothes. In this shifting atmosphere, the balance of power, though only slightly at first, began to tilt. Burkina Faso, a country often dismissed as marginal, had revealed the fragility of global giants. With no armies, no nuclear stockpiles, and no financial empire, it had nonetheless unsettled trillion-dollar institutions. The weapon was not force, but truth. Ibrahim Traoré had demonstrated something rarely seen in today's geopolitics. That moral conviction, when spoken clearly and without apology, could rattle structures designed to seem eternal. For millions of Africans and millions more across the global south, this transformation was electrifying. Traoré ceased to be seen as merely the president of a small, landlocked nation. Instead, he became a symbol, a living testament to the idea that courage and clarity could still shift the trajectory of history. In cafes in Dakar, in student halls in Accra, in WhatsApp groups across Nairobi, his name was spoken with reverence. Young people began comparing him openly to Sankara, Nkrumah, and Lumumba. His speeches circulated in translated clips, gaining millions of views, accompanied by subtitles in English, Arabic, and Mandarin. For many, he was the proof that Africa could still produce leaders who refused to bow. And so the question, inevitably, expanded far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. Would net zero remain what critics increasingly feared it was a slogan designed to soothe investors, to polish political reputations, to create the illusion of justice while leaving the structures of exploitation intact? Or could it, against the odds, be reborn as something genuine, something revolutionary, a promise to the powerless rather than a dividend to the powerful? By exposing the contradictions at its heart, Burkina Faso had forced the entire world to confront a truth that could no longer be ignored. What had begun as a technical dispute over climate contracts buried in legal fine print in Ouagadougou now evolved into something larger than any single nation. It became a battle not only over energy but over dignity, sovereignty, and the moral credibility of the global order itself. Each passing week added to the momentum. From the faint glow of newly installed solar panels in rural villages, where families celebrated a first taste of electricity, to the thunderous silence in international halls as delegates sat speechless before Traoré's uncompromising words, the message could not be mistaken. Africa would not wait for permission to rise. It was claiming its rightful place, demanding its dignity, and rewriting the very terms of engagement between North and South. At the heart of this awakening stood Ibrahim Traoré himself. His words crystallized the movement into a sentence that history would not forget. Standing at the podium of the United Nations, facing representatives of every major power, he declared, "We did not ask for permission to be free, we rose to claim it." Those words were more than a statement. They were a declaration that the time of silence was over, a warning that Africa would no longer be treated as a laboratory for foreign experiments, and a prophecy that the continent was entering a new phase of its history. They marked not only the rebirth of Burkina Faso, but also the stirring of an entire continent, an awakening that could no longer be dismissed or delayed. And so the world was left with a reckoning. Was it ready to acknowledge this new Africa, bold, unafraid, and unwilling to bow? Or would it cling to old habits of exploitation, even as their legitimacy crumbled? One thing was certain: the awakening had begun, and the world would have no choice but to face it.